It came with too much stuff, way too much stuff for the class. And I was trying to get a grapple with what was this new community like, what were they going to be able to do and so on. And this big charismatic guy stands up and he starts taking over the class and presenting. And I just get introduced to this new mentality. It's like, I've arrived in a new place. And it turned out I think Michael didn't take that particular version of the class and took it later with John and others. But Michael's been a fantastic introduction, I think larger than life figure, and it really makes one of the people that's made me most proud to be in this community. So I think I had the right introduction, and in a way we close off the journey with a day like this, which is as much a day of celebration as it is critical introspection. So I look forward to the presentation and to the questions that follow.
Thank you. All right. Good afternoon. Happy rainy, cloudy afternoon to you. It's nice to see some faces that I haven't seen in a while. Thank you for coming. My name is Michael Shank. And thanks to all of you, Dr. Simmons as chair, Dr. Maybeck, and Dr. Rubenstein for all your guidance and bringing me here to this point. I'm nervous. My chief of staff was like, how are you feeling about Friday? And all I said was one word, nervous, period. And she's like, I don't think I've ever seen you nervous. So forgive me. Let's jump right in. Climate conflict, positions and frames motivating stakeholder engagement. Why did I use climate conflict? Well, I'm keen to have, and I was talking with Dr. Maybeck about this before this show started, I'm keen to have the environmental science and policy community here at George Mason partner more with us here, and we need to partner with them, to really bring the environmental community, environmental sociology community, closer to the conflict analysis and conflict resolution community. The term is being used more and more. In my dissertation, I don't use climate conflict a lot. I usually use environmental conflict or climate change, just to be clear for the reader. But National Academy of Sciences had a report end of last year talking about this. Perhaps no surprise, warmer climate, the more conflict we'll see. And already over in the UK, I think I might use this instead, the International Institute for Strategic Studies published a series on climate conflict. So more and more this is being used, and I want to push it further into our community. Overview of what I'm going to talk about, how I got here. I'll get into my lit review, methodology, findings, analysis, and then some next steps. A bit about me. This is very much a reflection of who I am. I'm a vegetarian, have been a vegetarian for 20 years. I haven't owned a car for 20 years. I'm into zero population growth, don't plan to have kids. But also this is a reflection of my environmental policy background. For years I did biodiversity, watershed management, marine conservation, old growth restoration. On the West Coast, that was all I did. Moving to the East Coast, as most of you know, very involved in media and policy. I do communications for a congressman, but I also do policy work on the Hill. And my master's and now my PhD in conflict analysis and conflict resolution. So this is a nice confluence of everything that I'm interested in. But also in the field, more and more we're getting involved in environmental conflict. Frank Dukes, as an example, Hao and Zhang have written about this. So as the field grows, I want to grow us further in this direction. But also in the communicative practice, Dr. Simmons and I have talked about where to grow that, particularly as it pertains to media and policy practices. And I put red font there so I would make sure I remembered it. But Martin Hager talked about the theater of discursive structuration, and really that being media. And that's my world, and I'm keen to move us more into the structurative process, and I talk about that later on in my presentation. This also compelled me to write about this. Hottest 10 years on record happened since 2000. In fact, last year, 2012, hottest year on record. Highest carbon emissions on record in the past couple years. And this particular point, I left this board, this is fantastic. The National Climate Assessment, which Dr. Maybeck has been involved in, it's a 13 interagency and intra-agency body within our government, surprise, surprise, that they say in January, draft report, we may see worst case scenario 10 degree Fahrenheit increase within this century. That's big. 2 to 3 degrees is sustainable. UN was then kind of fear-mongering around 4 to 6, 4 to 7. So for the National Climate Assessment to say, potential worst case scenario is 10 degrees, we pay attention. We know it's anthropogenic, meaning we all cause it. The degree is disputed, and we know how to prevent it. Cap emissions, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and conservation. Contrast all of this with that, and we have very little political action or public action to prevent climate change. A few additional existing realities. I put a line here to show the discrepancy. Majority of America believes climate change is happening, that it's anthropogenic. That's good. And they believe we should do something. That's also good. And yet, we're still one of the highest carbon emitters per person per year, 20 to 25 tons I'm going to contextualize that for you a bit because China is only 4 to 5 tons per person per year. India, 1 to 2 tons per person per year. Climate talks continuing to really fail to put together an aggressive agreement. Kyoto, essentially the Kyoto Can, which was the first international climate agreement, got kicked down the road a little bit. In Doha in December, we were supposed to kind of re-up. We didn't. Essentially, we said in 2015, we'll look at it again, hopefully sign something for 2020. I was involved in this, in creating some legislation in the House. It was the first time we were going to do a cap and trade system where you cap emissions and then trade extra permits on top of that. It was pretty weak, but it failed to pass the Senate. Then we got in the middle of a financial crisis and legislation was dead completely. First term Obama doesn't mention climate change at all. And yet in his inauguration he says, we were all having our fingers crossed there, that we will respond to climate change. That was good news. But first term Obama, not mentioning it. Okay, my lit review. I break it into 4 sections. First, I look at the history of climate response, how the public's conquered their fear of climate. Some interesting data there. Then I get into the problematization of climate, current social movements, social constructionism. Then I get into factors influencing public opinion. Lastly, get into positioning theory and look at how publics have positioned themselves and their constituencies vis-a-vis climate. Mike Holm. So in the pre-modern era, climate was understood as something judgmental, and it was a fear of unknown causes. The gods and the goddesses and the fates are condemning us, and therefore everything climate-related was judgmental. That was conquered, that fear was conquered through science, through enlightenment, through rationality. Then in the modern era, climate was pathological. It was white northerners referring to the southern black and tropical climates in pejorative language. They used it for moral and racial superiority. That fear of unknown places, if you will, was conquered through travel, through mobility, through technology. This is where we are now. He says, fear of unknown futures. Climate is catastrophe. We haven't conquered it yet. He says it is conquerable, but it's only conquerable through new cultural movements and hierarchies of power. The cultural movements is important because I get into that later. A little bit more that I wanted to include. Climate is really bound up in memory, in identity, in culture, and symbolism. That's important because when I look at the analysis, all of this will be useful foundation. I want to get into this. So Sheldon Unger saying, for an effective environmental conflict claim, so for the public or policymakers or media, to effectively make an environmental claim, it has to have 3 characteristics. It needs to be immediate, meaning happening now. It needs to be visible, we can see it, and it can't be going away, it can't be transient. He said, ozone hole does very well on these fronts. The ozone hole in the late 80s, it was immediate, it was happening now. You could see it, there were mocked up pictures, if you will, because you couldn't actually see it. You could see it, and it wasn't going away. Climate change, very different. The worst effects are going to happen 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. They're happening now, and they're happening more frequently. Comes and it goes. Sometimes you have a cold winter, sometimes you have a hot winter. Sometimes you have a hurricane, sometimes you don't. People blame it on the natural cycle. The difference, characteristics are the same. Greenhouse gases, anthropogenic, happening in the atmosphere, can't hardly see it. The difference is this. And pardon the Reagan intensity here. But he said ozone hole had Hollywood affinities. Now this goes back to the topic about climate being very bound up in identity and culture and symbolism. And he, Sheldon Unger, talks about Star Wars, Starship Enterprise, that there were these rays penetrating the shield. And that created a strong flight corridor of a social scare, a moral panic, that it rallied the people to be willing to do this, and companies, to get rid of this. It was a very discrete behavioral change. But because of all these things, people were looking at this, and with climate change, we don't quite have these sustained visuals to create a real dramatic hot crisis, but ozone hole had it. Problematization of climate. 3 things are essential for an environmental claim or to rally the publics effectively against an environmental conflict to resolve it. First, social capital. Neil Adger talks about social capital has to be high for an environmental conflict to be resolved. I point out that this is particularly problematic in the US because we have low levels of social capital. We have high income inequality, which erodes social capital. And I want to bring up something Dr. Maybach had in his data, which I show in my dissertation. Egalitarian worldviews correspond strongly with a predisposition to support climate policy. So egalitarians if you will, I'll just make it a noun, are for climate policy. Individualistic worldviews, less so. Additionally, sustained issue attention. How do you sustain attention around environmental conflict? A couple things are key. Visuals, dramatic visuals, and availability or affect heuristics. And by that, I'll get into metaphors and frames later, but the Hollywood affinities, these kind of penetrating rays, all of that is available in affect heuristics, taps into emotion. Additionally, there needs to be an other. It doesn't always have to be a human other, but some kind of other. The other here was the ozone hole. We had a war against the ozone hole. And lastly, it usually rallies American ingenuity or innovation. You'll hear this around climate change. We can rally our market ingenuity or innovation to fix climate change. Lastly, media focus is essential. This has to do with the quantity of coverage theory, that media has to be paying attention to this conflict, otherwise the public will forget about it. This is problematic when it comes to climate because they focus on this. They focus on the conflict, not on the consensus, scientific consensus. They focus on the skeptics and the science or advocates, whatever you will call it, and they focus on that disputatious element. Boykoff, adding a little bit more here, talking about framing. Media has intentionally framed this confusion, this conflict. They're not focusing on the scientific consensus, they're focusing on the conflict. Lastly, I just want to include this. Media and policy actors, the ones I interviewed, very much like certainty in what they're about to issue, either in a press statement or in a speech on the House floor or the Senate floor. Science doesn't give them that. It gives them uncertainty, because scientists naturally are inherently thinking about, they can't predict the future without uncertainty. Okay, so influencing public opinion. You would think, nice to see you. You would think that more disastrous weather would get the public involved, and it's true, there's an initial spike, like after Hurricane Katrina, after Hurricane Sandy, there's an initial spike in attention and belief in climate change increases, and I talk about that in my dissertation. You would think more scientific information. If we just get more science out there, the public will get on board. In fact, that's not sustainable. What truly influences public opinion on a more sustainable fashion is media and political elite cues, which is so interesting for me because that's where my qualitative interviews lie. Talk about quantitative coverage theory there. So this is where public opinion is. I did some content analysis on this using Yale and GMU's work around public opinion. I want you to pay attention to these two. Majority of the American public is on board. They know that anthropogenic climate change is happening. This is great news. The not so great news from my perspective is this. The behaviors aren't matching their beliefs. High majorities aren't involved in influencing elected officials. They're not influencing media. They're not changing their consumptive habits. They're not punishing or rewarding companies based on their climate policies. They're not supporting nonprofits who are advocating for climate policy. And small percentages are actually changing their behavior. So they're on board in their belief and attitude. Behavior doesn't match that. I covered most of this earlier in context, but I just want to draw attention to this. ClimateGate, that sowed some doubt in the public mind. Essentially some skeptics, some climate skeptics hacked the computers around the Copenhagen trade talks, the climate talks, and positioned these hacked emails as scientists pulling the wool over the public's eyes, essentially, that it was a hoax. 8 investigations later, that's not the case. The science is legit, but it did sow a little bit of doubt in the public's mind. Positioning. So I'm thrilled to hear that he's here. That's fantastic. But I use positioning theory to look at how the publics position themselves vis-a-vis climate. I pull in frames and metaphors for the reasons mentioned earlier, that climate is inherently bound up in identity, culture, symbolism, narrative, social memory. And I use a little bit of Bronwyn Davies and how he talks about the othering. I'll use that as a verb, but how we create others in this us versus them positioning process. So this is what I chronicle in one of my chapters. In the 70s, 60s, and 70s, when climate change really started to be talked about, the environmental community comes out and says, all right, the problem is all of you, and they use very much an ecocentric, biocentric worldview or frame. You are killing the planet. Consilience is a great example of this, E.O. Wilson's work. This was problematic because the positioning created an outgroup. It created another and actually created violent conflict. When I was doing policy work in the Northwest, environmentalists were in occasional violent conflict with loggers because that was the position. So this This ultimately didn't work to get everyone on board because it positioned us versus them. Then this came along, the Evangelical Environmental Network, Rick Warren and others, saying the Bible tells us we got to protect the planet. Obama used this in his inauguration speech where he cited God in terms of stewardship. Good position in terms of it's moving a constituency that may not have been involved here. Creating an outgroup, however, because not everyone's religious. They're agnostic, atheists, or even other religions, even though most holy texts tend to have something about environmental stewardship. This is more recent. Businesses going green to save green, not because they're necessarily environmentalists. The only potential problem here, the outgroup that's created, it splits the haves and the have-nots. I was at Tom Friedman's house, and he was very excited to show me that his house was powered by geothermal, and then he showed me his hybrid Lexus. Generally, green behavior in many people's minds is out of reach because it's too expensive. We haven't subsidized those industries in the way that we've subsidized fossil fuel industries. Plus, per my earlier point about public data, it's not really changing behavior yet. This is ubiquitous on the Hill. America, we need to be energy secure, energy independent. We have to unfetter our addiction to these hostile states and these terrorist states. Unsurprising there that the other that's created is the Muslim state or the Arab state or Venezuela. And so that's not an all-inclusive position. Lastly, social positioning, World Health Organization getting on board. This is an effective frame. The only problem, and I've been in some of the circles of the small island states as they're lobbying the UN, is that they don't like the framing of first world, third world, developed world, developing world, rich world, poor world, and that's how it's talked about. The first world developed itself, now the poor world wants to develop itself, but they can't because they're going to cause carbon emissions, and so there's this battle. It's not an all-inclusive positioning. I think where my research contributes to the literature is on three fronts: looking at the positioning and the othering that's happening, the outgrouping that's happening. Two, looking at the gap between belief and behavior, and what might be responsible for that gap. And three, looking at positions and frames going forward that might enable increased engagement. Qualitative research, mostly interviewing members of Congress and media, but also doing content analysis on media reporting and congressional legislation, congressional websites. Main research questions are these: what positions are motivating congressional and media engagement? What new narratives might increase that engagement, and what's required for those narratives to emerge? Just a summary of the questions. I essentially asked, how'd you come in contact with climate change? When did you learn about it? What shaped your belief? Once you believe something, whether it was pro-climate or anti-climate, what did you do about it? What obstacles did you face? Does your sector have a responsibility to lead? Who are some of the effective leaders? And what would enable increased engagement for you? This is what I found. These were the top two positions from my data. Pretty consistently, security, we're funding the enemy, and there's a green incentive here. Obama, again, using this in his inauguration, talking about we have an opportunity to lead green tech. So he was using this position. This wasn't used to justify behavior now, but it was consistently used to understand how they first came in contact with it. So pretty consistently, all the members of Congress and media came in contact with climate through some environmental experience. I know Dr. Maybach talks about this too. It's very experiential. They were watching the glaciers melt. They were seeing more mosquitoes than they had ever seen before. They were in a place that should have been cold and it was really hot. Very experiential. These two used very little social positioning. I gave an example of someone who was using it, someone in the media. Religious positioning used hardly at all. But again, Obama referencing this in his inauguration. This is who I interviewed. I had pretty good access, given that my work is in communications, so I was able to interview most of the international and national papers, as well as TV and radio and the Hill papers. This is what I found. So good news is, they're on board anthropogenic climate change. They believe it's happening, majority. They don't think they should lead. In fact, they feel powerless, which is consistent with their behavior. There was no behavior. Minimal personal behavior at home. They changed their light bulbs, turned down the heat a little bit. Professionally, their main obstacle was we have a duty to be impartial. We have to present both sides of the issue, 50-50. We can't get involved in any way, despite them acknowledging to me in the interview, hey, I know it's happening, but I can't do anything about it. In fact, one reporter for the Financial Times saying, listen, if you want me to do something, just make a law. In terms of context, this is really interesting because as media firms save money, cut costs, stop deliveries, they're firing first, this is from the data, this is what they're telling me, they're firing first their environmental reporters and their science reporters. Case in point, a couple weeks ago, New York Times says we're eliminating our environmental desk. The New York Times, like the elite shaper of public thinking around issues like the environment, eliminating their department. It's not a priority for media. If it has an economic tie, it is, but otherwise, no. If it's soundbite friendly, okay, because reporters are working on quick deadline, they can't do research. A lot of reporters saying, I don't have time to do research, and since we fired our environmental reporter, it's up to me now to cover it since it's a political issue. So increasingly, it's not making it into the media because it doesn't fit into the cycle for clear ways. Congressionals, I was able to interview both Republicans and Democrats, less Republicans, and I cite a National Journal story wherein Coral Davenport, which she's a huge environmental writer, really pushing the climate change agenda, tried to interview Republicans and failed. All the Republican offices said no initially, and then I think she finally got some on board. Was able to get some on board, and they serve on these committees. This is important because when I get to the findings, you'll see why this is important. Generally, climate change is talked about in this committee, but it also has ramifications here and here, and actually all throughout the process, definitely in appropriations. I interviewed members on these committees. Now, that's important because of this. So, similarly, they're on board, majority saying yes, it's happening, anthropogenic climate change is happening. They do think they should lead. In fact, they're pretty vociferous about this. Yes, we absolutely have a responsibility to lead. And yet, minimal personal behavior or professional behavior. In fact, one member of Congress, Democrat, I was surprised this Democrat said this, individual action isn't going to be the big tipper. So very little personal engagement. Professional engagement, the main obstacle is this. I'm not on the right committee, I'm not on the right caucus or coalition, and I have no public mandate. Very similar in terms of context. Many of them saying they have a limited constituency, limited opportunities, no public mandate. They're saying the public isn't reaching out to them at all. This is confirmed by the previous data that I showed where the public isn't reaching out to them at all. High majorities aren't. So this is what got me thinking then, if there's a belief-behavior gap, is that belief-behavior gap consistent with other security threats to public safety? So what I looked at was terrorism. Turns out that media does not exhibit the same behavior they exhibited on the climate threat that they do with the terrorism threat. In fact, quite the opposite. They disproportionately cover it. They cover it more than any other issues. They cover it with longer stories. When the threat goes up, they give a lot of attention. When the threat goes down, they give very little attention. So as a public interface, that threat never went down because they never communicated that to you. And lastly, there's a really interesting thing with the media is that they generally expect military intelligence, where they show, per my previous point, the disputatiousness within climate science. So they respect military intelligence, but they're quite willing to challenge or show the disputation with climate science. Case in point, Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, New York Times even saying, yes, they exist. Later, they kind of had a mea culpa and said, oh wait, but exemplifying the general respect for certain intelligence, but not for the other. Congressionals, same thing. Exhibiting little hesitancy when it comes to talking about terrorism or national security, even if they're not on the appropriate committee. I studied all their websites in the House, and pretty consistently, terrorism was top. They have an issue tab. Terrorism was top, environmental, certainly not global warming or climate change. Environmental was near the bottom in terms of priority. But less qualitatively, more quantitatively, in the 112th Congress, nearly 1,200 bills on terrorism, national security, 0 bills global warming, under 100 bills climate change. So a very different focus, irrespective of committee. All of this having a pretty big impact on constituent and public opinion. Strong correlations between mass-mediated terror alerts and the public's evaluation of terrorism. Consequently, we think it's a very serious threat, top priority. Irrespective of the fact that the risk to American blood and treasure is pretty small comparatively to what climate change has in terms of risk. So, then I went to study why that belief-behavior gap on climate. And I look at 3 levels of analysis: personal civil sphere, economic sphere, and political sphere. Max Horkheimer, Theodore Adorno, Jeffrey Alexander, all saying essentially the same thing, that the culture industry, the media industry promulgate this idea that consumption gives you, and this is some basic human needs stuff, but consumption gives you equality and competence within the civil sphere. And if you're not consuming, you're not able to engage in the civil sphere with competence, adequacy, or power. And you're dismissed as a result. And thanks to cheap material, now even low-income communities can engage in that consumption, can showcase their autonomy and their equality. Anthony Downs talking about a democratization of privilege. No longer is it the elite minority few that can consume. Now, thanks to cheap material, we all can. I included a piece from a study that The Economist featured, last place version, where they were trying to study why poor people, low-income people, generally support policy that doesn't elevate their lot. And it's because, this last place version, this was their theory, that you always want someone beneath you. And consumption allows that quest to always be climbing up so that someone, and you're exhibiting it through consumption. Problem with this consumption is that it's usually carbon intensive, which goes back to the climate. Economic sphere. This was perhaps most interesting to me because intuitively it made sense, but I bring in Habermas to talk about life world and communicative action, that on the carbon consumption front, there is little to no communicative action with the cradle-to-grave cycle of a product. And by that I mean thinking about the food we eat, the houses we live in, the cars we drive, the clothes we wear. We're not interacting with, we're not killing the animals, certainly. We're not logging the trees. We're not mining for the ore for the car. We're not picking the cotton. And we have nothing usually to do with the waste. We're not interacting with the waste. Poor people often are because wastes are often near poorer communities. But there is no cradle-to-grave interaction, no communicative action, no Habermasian life world. Lastly, on political sphere, and this is beyond just the climate issue, but though I show with war and terrorism, the flight corridor helps you leap this gap in structuration. But in our political sphere, very little democratic dialectic. I hold responsible for that. An increasing trend here where there's corporate influence through Citizens United, which was a Supreme Court decision to essentially allow no cap on corporate contributions. Now political action committees are more powerful than before. But I do look at Galbraith in terms of organizational power because nonprofits like MoveOn.org ostensibly are there to mobilize constituency, but actually what I argue is that it has a deleterious effect because as an individual, I'm relying on organizational power to represent me in the centers of power. I no longer have that power. Interesting findings here. Unsurprising, at a local level, higher trust in local officials. At a federal level, less trust. And that's not surprising because at a local level you have more of a dialectic, you have more of a structured process. Voter turnout is higher in smaller geographic democracies, lower in bigger geographic democracies. In fact, in the US, every 2 years it's below 50%. And in smaller geographic democracies, it's up in the 80 and 90%. And bringing in a little C. Wright Mills, because I'm a fan, saying the distance between the individual and centers of power is getting greater. It's leading to indifference and apathy, which we saw earlier in the data where people don't believe in their individual power to affect climate change or to resolve climate change. So, this is where I propose a new narrative. To create some kind of flight corridor, some kind of social scare, some kind of moral panic that is capable of helping us leap those political divides, the lack of dialectic. Mike Holm, whom I referred to earlier, saying the war on terror gives us these cultural linguistic frames that could be useful in a war on global warming. Stephen Hawking comparing it, noting that millions more will die in global warming than in terrorism. The Enviro guy for UBS in Oxford also seconded it. And I said it in an op-ed that I wrote with Congressman Meeks, who's on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, that we wrote for the Christian Science Monitor, that Security Council has to deal with it, because it is that level of a war. Ban Ki-moon comparing climate change to war. Richard Branson calling for a war room in order to deal effectively with climate change. This is particularly interesting because what war does, even if we have low social capital, low egalitarianism, and high income inequality, and we're very individualistic in America, the one time we all come together is in a wartime scenario, where social capital egalitarianism goes off the charts. And this, Charles Lane was talking about this, that it allows us to bring the American public together. We've done it before on various other wars, war on poverty, war on drugs, war on cancer. And it's this, to use Jeffrey Alexander's work in the civil sphere, it's this civilizing meta-language. and it really brings people together, increases egalitarianism. A couple do's and don'ts that I want to be mindful of. I don't want to create any othering or outgrouping. I think that's possible because I don't want to position another human outside this tent. I want it to be a progressive, inclusive movement. I brought this up because climate advocates tend to use this. Climate chaos, climate crisis, that's problematic because it reinforces a debilitating fear. It's difficult to diffuse. And there is this point where this latent dread leads to fatalism and complacency. Where it's like, what can I do? It's so overwhelming. I think of my mother when I talk about this stuff because she thinks climate change is too overwhelming. She can't do anything. So we have to be very, very careful about the words we use because it could lead to a debilitating fatalism. Similarly, Maybach and I were talking about this earlier, there's a tendency, particularly on the Hill and elsewhere, to talk about clean energy. And it's good. That's very bipartisan. But will it create the flight corridor, this hot crisis, this moral panic that we need? A couple of do's. Make sure we're including all groups. Cultural movements that I referred to earlier. We need morally good behavior where consumption is sustainable, but it's good. And again, like I've talked about, I bring in a little axelrod in the dissertation and talk about the shadow of the future must be sufficiently large enough to compel action. So we're already doing this. We're geoengineering. And this is what I'm concerned Obama, when he said we're going to respond to climate change, I think he's referring to this. And this is our plan. We're going to put mirrors in the galaxy to fend off the sun. We're going to create fake clouds to cool the planet. We're going to create actual factories where algae will absorb carbon, and then we'll turn that into energy. That will get us perhaps only so far. We're already trying this with some success. International science is on board. The talks, not so effective, in part because the US isn't leading the way there. This, in my dissertation, is where it lies, in creating new cultural movements that change behavior. So this is what I explore, social engineering. It's been done before, successfully in Japan. And the reason why I bring up Japan, Japan actually has, in the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, rich world states, the lowest income inequality, highest social capital, highest egalitarianism, highest collective mentality and worldview. In the winter, they said, dress up so we can save on heat. Summer, dress down so we can save on AC. Very effective during their energy crisis and electricity crisis. We've changed behaviors through new cultural movements all the time. On the war on terror, people generally respond. If you see something, say something. You can only travel in certain ways. We've created a whole cultural movement around this that's changing behavior. And the data supported this. These were the ingredients. Members of Congress and media identifying all the ingredients necessary for social engineering to be effective. The top things that kept coming up: Hollywood leadership, federal campaign, more visuals. All necessary for creating this flight corridor. So we've done it before, and members of Congress and media talked about this. We did it with tobacco. This was a federal grassroots campaign. Hollywood is starting to get involved. These look like wartime scenarios. They're all related to global warming, but if you watch the films, they don't mention global warming. Climate change isn't remotely mentioned at all. There's no good versus bad behavior. So Hollywood has an opportunity to take this to a next level. But even if we do all this social engineering, I suggest in the dissertation, it will be insufficient unless we address a few other things. In political systems, improving and increasing the dialectic and the structuration between you as the public and the policymakers. A couple ways of doing that I mentioned here. Member of Congress saying, listen, I've got to have the public and the media talking about it, otherwise I can't do anything about it. So too, in economic systems, increasing the likelihood that you're going to be in communicative action in a Habermasian life world with the consequences of your carbon consumption. There are ways to do that: localized trade, localized manufacturing, microeconomies, sustainable economies. But this is where I think the nugget lies, and in the literature review, nobody really delved into this. So I think in terms of the social engineering has been discussed somewhat in literature review. But I think herein lies the answer. This is from the Spirit Level, which Dr. Sandoli showed to me a couple years ago, and I found it golden. 2 UK economists looking at inequality in the rich world. US, highest income inequality correlates strongly with low levels of social capital, low levels of trust, low levels of egalitarianism, mobility, etc. Japan has the least amount of income inequality, so they have high trust, high collectivism, high egalitarianism, high social capital. that if we ultimately want to create the context in which we're predisposed to support climate policy, we have to address this as well. Future research, obviously here, because I'm talking a lot about it, and I was able to go into it a little bit in my dissertation, but a lot of unanswered questions there. Here, you know, I was fascinated with Horkheimer and Adorno and Alexander talking about consumption, and should we allow for that consumption to happen? Is it okay that people want to be equal and that consumption gets them there? Or could we address basic human needs in a different way where they don't actually have to consume so much to find that equality and civility within the civil sphere? And then, of course, I think a lot of opportunity to get involved in economic systems analysis and political systems analysis in improving both dialectic and communicative action. This is what I'm committing to doing, and I certainly want SCAR to head in this direction too, in terms of building a bridge between the conflict community and the environmental community, the conflict community and the media, and the policy communities. We're close to DC, which makes a lot of this action quite easy, and Dr. Maybach has already been very involved in helping bridge this gap. But we're only going to see more environmental conflicts due to resource scarcity, population growth, 10 billion in 2025, and as climate change worsens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a very interesting presentation. As is our custom, let me turn it over to our outside member, Dr. Maybach, and let's hear your question.
Oh boy, me first. Really interesting to hear you summarize 250 pages of wonderful scholarship into 30 or 40 minutes of highlights. There were a couple of things that come out in your dissertation that you didn't choose to touch upon in your oral presentation. I'm curious about that. So in your dissertation you talk about the fact that there is essentially more agreement about the issue both in the media and on the Hill, among members on the Hill, than you anticipated. And that really wasn't one of the points you chose to mention here. I'd like to hear your thoughts about that, and then I have a follow-up question.
Yeah, I was very surprised with Republican and media support. I think what interested me the most with really smart media reporters and editors acknowledging in the same breath that climate change is happening, that it's going to be detrimental, and yet they have to be skeptical. Like that they could switch, I can't get that because I'm such an advocate, but that they can switch in the same breath from that knowledge to a kind of detached apathy. So I was surprised to see as many media on board. Help me explore this further in terms of why I didn't include it there, I think just for brevity and trying to be succinct and concise as possible, in terms of that surprise. I was surprised to see the Republicans as on board as they were, but I think given that it was not for attribution, completely off the record, and I would never name names, they would admit, yeah, as much.
Something that you talked about at length in your dissertation itself is the difficulty you had in getting access to Republican members and Blue Dog, essentially, centrist Democratic members. Do you think that what you found from your member interviews, that there is any concern about a sample bias? In other words, you spoke to a non-representative group of members, and therefore what you're able to learn and say about that may not actually represent the totality.
Without question, and you know, in my struggle in finding New Dems or Blue Dogs to get on board, or even Republicans, was a struggle in terms of sample bias. I felt somewhat validated by Coral Davenport saying in the National Journal that she tried to get Republicans to talk with her about climate change to no avail, and so I felt like, okay, I'm not the only one trying to knock on doors. And these were Republican-friendly offices where I had staff who could have easily scheduled an interview with me. But yeah, without question, this was what was available to me, and I think it gave me some good findings where I could take the analysis, even though it was a sample bias. But yeah, without question.
So do I get to continue?
Please, yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
I mean, I guess given that you're in this business too, like how do we get a good sampling when they absolutely refuse to talk to you? Like, how do you find, from a research standpoint, how do you work around that obstacle?
state the limitations of
Yeah.
the reality that you encountered, and you did a nice job of that.
Okay.
So you are in search of, you are in search of a frame that is inclusive. Yet the war frame strikes me as inherently, if not identifying, at least suggesting there is another. Whether that's in the war on drugs, the other are the drugs, or the people who produce the drugs, or sell the drugs, or in other ways enable the distribution of drugs.
Yeah.
In the war on cancer, I've been involved in both of these wars, by the way. In the war on cancer, the war is our own aberrant biology. It's, our cells have turned against us. But in both of those cases, there are clear others. So I'm having a hard time reconciling your quest for an inclusive frame, yet your seeming enchantment with the notion of the war metaphor.
Yeah, well, not enchanted with it. And actually, I was thinking maybe a New Deal was a better way to think about it, because that really changed behavior at a national level. I'd be interested in Dr. Simmons' viewpoint on the New Deal, because you studied that. But in thinking about the war on poverty and the war on cancer and the war on drugs, all of those being somewhat covert threats, I hear you on cancer and drugs having obvious human others. War on poverty, though, if we really wanted to fix poverty, would be a structural re-engineering that could be as inclusive as a war on global warming. I think given that there was a war on the ozone hole and that the hole became the enemy, I was worried about the war frame because I believe in nonviolence, and I come from a background where the war metaphor is something you would try to avoid because it was an inherently violent metaphor. But I actually, in the process of doing it, felt like actually we need this kind of civilizing meta-language, but I also didn't want to create an enemy out of nature. So I don't want people to be afraid of nature like they were with the ozone, where the Department of Interior had this personal protection plan in the 80s, which was like, stay at home between 11 and 4, don't go outside, and then people became afraid of nature. You don't want people to become afraid of nature. You don't want the other to be nature, per se, but how do you create an other that's non-human, but that is threatening enough in the way the ozone hole was that it rallies consumer behavior differently and public behavior differently. So, yeah, the verdict's out a little bit in my mind in terms of whether or not the war was the right civilizing meta-language, but it felt like war on poverty might have been enough analogous that it could work. But we still haven't won that one, so maybe the war frame isn't effective.
One of your basic results is that there's this profound disconnect between beliefs and behaviors, both among your media interviewees and your member representatives. This is very much an area of research interest of mine. To what degree should we expect there to be consistency between knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors, which is just a slightly different formulation of what you found. And so your findings don't surprise me.
Right.
That's my statement. My question is, should they? Should anybody be surprised by your findings, or is this law consistent with essentially what we know about the relative low correlation between knowledge, attitude, and behavior on any aspect of human experience?
I'll take vegetarianism as an example because I've been a vegetarian, as I mentioned. Went vegan this year, but a vegetarian for 20 years. Most people, when they find out, they say, "Oh yeah, I did vegetarianism for like a year, and then I stopped." And people tend not to stay with vegetarianism because they like their meat so much. And we had this big debate in our congressional office about this. And what always surprises me is that people who are mindful from an egalitarian worldview about other deleterious impacts of their consumptive behavior, when it comes to meat or having babies or anything like that, it becomes inherently individual in that moment. And that's always puzzled me, that there can be such a disconnect between what they know and believe, pretty mindful global thinkers. They know how agriculture is a major contributor to carbon emissions and thus meat. They get it cognitively, but it hasn't changed behavior. And I think where I was going initially with the dissertation is really where Americanism has inculcated certain behaviors so strongly that it would become difficult for people to ever get away from their hot dogs and hamburgers because it is so much part of the American identity. But particularly on this, I found it confounding because there was kind of this repeat performance of a disconnect. And maybe it was just my worldview the entire time because my lifestyle has been so ecocentric in that focus. And so I was just biased in my thinking the entire time, which I'm sure it was.
So you mentioned the president's inaugural comments about climate change in his inaugural address. I interpreted what you say to be an open question as to whether or not you felt that was a good frame, and good in the sense of an inclusive frame that would help to rally the American people behind to respond to this issue. But later in your presentation and elsewhere in your dissertation, you do mention that you think a moral frame is potentially inclusive, potentially motivating. I'd just like to hear just a reaffirmation of that, or not, if that's not your feeling.
Yeah, well, this is where the morality of war, I think, is potentially so effective in bringing the American public together. Morality separate from, irrespective of religion per se, even though he did use God, and God could be supernatural and a supra-moral frame. I was concerned about his tech frame in terms of green tech. We need to lead the way, because there are limitations in that, and it still encourages pretty heavy consumption. We're just going to try to make it green consumption. So I don't, and I was mentioning to Dr. Simmons, the response, he said we're going to respond to climate change. I'm concerned that it's going to be geoengineering only, that we're going to do adaptive response. We're not going to prevent it. We're not going to try to stop it. I do think we need, per Mike Holmes' points earlier, where climate is, and Galinsky's points, where climate is so bound up in identity and social memory and culture and symbolism, we do need a moral frame. There needs to be good behavior and bad behavior. Otherwise, I don't think we're going to move forward fast enough. So yeah, I do think we do.
Good. Last question.
Yeah.
Your one of your journalists who you interviewed, he said, he or she, excuse me, for making assumptions, he or she said, if you want me to change my behavior, pass a law.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear your thoughts about that. Does he or she have it right or wrong?
Well, certainly industry would feel that way, because industry is more and more involved, saying, hey, create some regulation, because we can't sit in this nebulous world of unregulated whatever in terms of power plants, etc. But this goes back to the political sphere and economic sphere analysis, particularly on the lack of dialectic. If the public believes it but isn't engaging their policymakers, the policymakers feel like they have no mandate, no constituency. So absolutely, a law is critical. And the fact that California is moving forward on a cap and trade, because you're saying, U.S., you're too slow to the game, so we're going to lead on a cap and trade mechanism. They launched it a couple months ago. We will get that eventually. It's just not coming soon enough.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Rubenstein.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up directly on my colleague's questions, which it seems to me, I don't know if this is the direction that he wanted to lead in, but it's the direction that I think follows logically of some of the things that the questions imply. And you started to answer one of them already. I was going to make the point that when it comes to the need for war, some kind of war campaign, war metaphor, that just because Jeffrey Alexander thinks that's civilizing, meta language doesn't mean it is. And of course there is, where I jumped was the point at which you said, the one time we come together is in a war kind of situation. When, as you mentioned yourself, in answer to one of his questions, the New Deal was one time that we came together not in a war framework at all. And interesting too, because we come together in a war framework to take orders. We come together in a war framework out of fear, and because wanting to be protected by the people at the top, and saying we volunteer, we enlist, or whatever. You protect us, and we'll follow your orders. Whereas the New Deal was a bottom-up social movement. People came together at the bottom first, and it wasn't until they had come together for a number of years that Roosevelt decided he was a left-winger. That's a social phenomenon that we really have not seen much of since the 30s. a brief burst in the 40s, but that was pretty much it, because then we were swallowed up in Cold War, etc. So anyway, this is not even I'm not sure that this is a question, or it's kind of an appeal, and you're not necessarily to do with a dissertation. I'm not suggesting any revision of the dissertation, which I think is a wonderful piece of work. But in your own thinking about what kind of media campaign, etc., what kind of public campaign would be necessary, what kind of campaign would be necessary to do something about what seems to me to be kind of the elephant in the room, which is your reference to, early on, to Hume talking about the need for new hierarchies of power, the need for social capital, social solidarity, the need for egalitarianism. All of these items that you already identified in your dissertation as prerequisites for a kind of social mobilization that would produce an effective response to global warming by the leaders. Something happens where you end up just talking about the leaders, and you end up just talking about propaganda. That's too harsh. I mean, I take back the word propaganda. You end up talking about communications. So I'm wondering, how does this other stuff happen? You know, where does the social capital come from? And how can it, and this is one long question, then I'm gonna stop. And how can you even answer that question unless you other the power elite? Unless you other the corporate, the big money. I don't see then how you can do anything about the kind of structural issues that you yourself are pointing at.
Yeah.
As part of the problem.
Okay, a couple things. I think I have three answers. One, the social engineering, as I prescribed it there and in the dissertation, completely insufficient for transformation and change, which is why I got into the structural engineering, which included inequality. Which leads me to my second point. There's an interesting, I was thinking about this later, it's not reflected in the dissertation, but I think it has merit to your question, which is completely valid in terms of the work, the problematic framing of the war, as opposed to Nidio. When the environmental movement started, really in the 60s and 70s, that's when inequality really opened up. And if you look at a chart of income inequality, it began in the late 60s and 70s, and that's where it grew. That's interesting to me, because if that's where our inequality grew, is that also why we never actually were successful in dealing with climate change? Because climate change has come up, it's peaked before. We've had temporary hot crises and moral panics. Late 70s, boom. Late 80s, boom. Late 90s, boom. And then in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, you have actual bipartisanship. As I mentioned in the dissertation, Newt Gingrich beside Nancy Pelosi talking about climate change, unheard of. He would never do that now. It's very different times now. But then, it peaked. I wonder if climate change came, and it wouldn't have come pre-1950, because we only had, as a global population, 2 billion, so we weren't exhausting resources in the way that we are now. Now we're at over 7 billion. But what if climate change came in the early 1900s or even 1800s, where as a society, perhaps even as a global society, but as an American society, there was more egalitarianism, higher social capital. Now with inequality, really opening up the gap where you have 50 million in poverty, 100 million in low income, so half of America is poor, and it's very difficult to create that egalitarianism. Is it even possible? And then to your, I had a third point, but I lost it. Or maybe I covered it. What was the end of your arc?
Oh, I have.
Big money, the power.
I said.
Oh, big money and power elite.
Yeah.
So initially, when I met with Dr. Simmons on the early phases of, who is going to be the other, I mean, we weren't using the language back then, but fossil fuel industry and particularly the corporate elites when it comes to Citizens United and super political action committees, but really the fossil fuel industry, and to some extent utilities and others, but really coal, oil, and gas. Having spent a lot of my time in this effort, the previous efforts to position them out of the game have been completely unsuccessful. And so part of it is the exhaustion on my part, and I feel I'm pretty young, and maybe Dr. Maybach can speak to this more, but every previous effort, which is why I kind of chronicled the previous positioning by the environmental community and other communities, to keep them out of the conversation has never led to anything other than intractability. So I am certainly not in favor, which is why I talk about we need to amend the Constitution so that Citizens United is no longer effective from a Supreme Court standpoint, but so that we can increase the dialectic between individuals. People would even think that's radical, for me to say that we don't have a dialectic in this country, that we don't have a structured process between agent and centers of power in this country, that we think this country is democratic. So I feel like I'm on board with you in terms of ways in which we need to undermine corporate influence. Ways of going about doing that is potentially dismantling some of the non-governmental organizations, the lobbyists, which I mentioned in the dissertation, to free up the space for the individual. And I use my family as kind of like this case study. They're not engaged. And they know better, but they're not. Why are they not? And part of it is, in my mind, this kind of this activism that they do with the click of a mouse that gives them the impression that they're interacting in some kind of dialectic with members of Congress, and they're not. They don't care about the email list that comes in. So I do feel like we do need to dismantle the corporate power to make an enemy out of the fossil fuel industry. I've tried before, and I feel like it's been an ineffective pursuit.
Well, I just say, as a follow-up and a response to that I wouldn't certainly not advocate making an enemy out of any particular industry. Especially not the fossil. When you have a situation in which you have this growing inequality that you draw attention to yourself, you have wage stagnation or decline over a period of 30 years, you have a jobs crisis, which is almost as bad now as it was at the height of the Great Recession. And then you go to people in West Virginia, and you say, by the way, we've decided that you're digging for that coal is screwing up the environment, so you got to stop. And by the way, we don't have any other way of creating jobs for you, because we don't believe that government should be an employer of last resort. And because anytime anybody says that, let's even go back to the New Deal for some inspiration, they'll be called a socialist. And we're not willing to be called socialists, even when we are. Then there's no solution to, certainly making an enemy, making a villain of the coal industry under that kind of situation is, but I think it calls attention to a problem that I don't claim to have the answer to, okay? Because you're dealing with an immediate, a fairly short-term crisis. Things are getting worse fast on the climate front. But the villain is not the coal industry. The villain is the late capitalist system that systematically produces politically powerless people, that systematically reduces social capital, that systematically increases inequality, and that systematically fouls the environment. So if you're not at least calling that by its name, if you're not saying, yes, ever since the 20s, thinkers who admirable thinkers like a number that you named already, Horkheimer and Adorno and et cetera, have said, yes, this is the way a kind of decadent capitalist system operates. Or some people call it late capitalism, or some people, there are different names for it. Then then a discussion that we need to have about how can that system be changed doesn't start. Right? It seems to me. And that's my problem.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, clearly we're not going to have the revolution and overthrow it in my lifetime. Although, come to think of it, Lenin said that too. But I don't think we will. And if we did, it might not be a good idea anyway. But what kinds of changes can be made that lead in the direction of system transformation?
Right.
I think some of your material at the end of the dissertation is pointing in that direction. But I'm a little bit skeptical of the idea that somehow a media campaign can do this unless it's activating people at the base.
Right, and I'm in full agreement, which is why I think it was important to end on this structural analysis and the violent systems, economically or politically, that are preventing the individual from fully engaging in a dialectic, either economically with the carbon consumption or politically with their policymakers.
Okay.
You know.
All right.
No, I'm with you. It's as big of a
Yeah, I know. It's just
question.
hard. It's really hard to. It's hard to get your arms.
Yeah.
around it.
Thanks, Rich. Let me turn to a slightly different question. I'll touch on some of the same things. Maybe I'll pick up on the bias issue, the same bias issue a little bit. And not supply an answer, but at least convert. So, when you have a population, is there some reason to suspect that there's this gap between what people know and what they're willing to do? And the reason that they don't want to talk to you is that they know about that gap and they're embarrassed by it. Does that not reaffirm, in a sense, the finding? You know, that it might just be exacerbated. I mean, it could be that there really is the lack of knowledge as well. I mean, it seems to me the surprising feature in the Republican sample would be if you found that they really didn't believe that there was any climate change. I mean, maybe that isn't surprising, but the only thing I'm really curious about, what troubled me thinking about sampling, was that issue of is there something that represents a really difference in cognitive understanding of the problem? And I don't know the answer. We won't know the answer, but at least seems to me when I thought about the data that there's probably that sense of embarrassment and being called out for that might at least reinforce some of the findings. And then that leads me to think about this concept of the Republican war on science. And I wonder, and it might feed into the cognitive piece. So what is one of the problems that we have? And this kind of came up in ClimateGate, that the way that intellectuals have been framed, as you know, so I've done work on professors and their political views. I have a book coming out maybe this year, we hope, about that. And the way that the entire intellectual project, including science, has been framed as somehow liberal, bad, other. Does that make it difficult for us to use facts in this respect? I mean, is that an inherent limit in reaching across the aisle in a way that you found? I mean, I know you informally know a lot of Republicans, independent research. So do you think that suspicion of science itself is a barrier that you face in trying to promote this in the public sphere yourself?
Yeah. To go to Dr. Maybach's work with George Mason and Yale, their Centers for Climate Change Communication, there's a lot of trust. The public holds trust in certain messengers. One of those messengers, perhaps surprisingly, we were talking about this before, is meteorologists. And to some extent science, but not UN science, not the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. To some extent scientists, less so Congress, but meteorologists. And Dr. Cobb is involved in that, which is a great opportunity, because if the public trusts them, that's a good thing. Yeah, I do use science occasionally in the articles that I write for the congressman or for myself, but less so. I try to put it on the public, because if Congress doesn't feel like they have a mandate and there's limited constituency because they're not reaching out, I'm going to do the best I can to be the interlocutor there to say, actually, you do have a mandate, and here's the mandate, which is why I rely on his data so much, and others. The journal and Personality and Social Psychology talks about that as well, in terms of what millennials are doing on climate change or not. But yeah, I got a lot of text messages from colleagues during the inauguration saying, science, all caps, all caps, all caps, because Obama was embracing science. But I think coming from a democratic perspective where we rely on facts, and my undergrad was in the arts, and I used to write a lot then about how effective communication was inherently nonverbal, which is why I kept reinforcing the flight corridor, this moral panic, this social scare, this hot crises, because all of that is going to be conjured up not necessarily by science, but by erroneous connections between the ozone hole and Ronald Reagan's sarcoma lesions, and for the Department of Interior to be kind of so way off base in his personal protection plan, all of that is really emotional and intuitive, which is why I probably reached for war, because I thought it was civilizing in that way. But as a communicator, I'm constantly in search of what's going to be the new effective angle. I don't know that I've found it.
No, yeah. Speaking about the angles, do you think that there's as a practitioner, which you are, communicative practice, or whatever you want to call that, is there an advantage in a single strategy? Should everyone get behind a single strategy? For example, are you hoping that everyone will embrace the war imagery and get behind it, or is there, one of the most interesting parts of the dissertation for me is chapter 3 with all the positions that you lay them out.
Yeah.
Is it still reasonable to use some of those other positionings or communicative strategies, or do you think everyone ought to get behind some big one?
Well, I first thought then, when I was doing that chapter, and it's one of my favorites too, that a aggregate composite of those multifold strategies would create a whole, that we actually would have everyone encompassed, that there would be enough small tents that it would equal a big tent. And certainly environmentalists will always be environmentalists, and NRDC and WRI and others will position themselves as they position themselves. I think they've learned not to other humans quite so much, so there's a change in that. But we'll need religious groups, and we'll need the economic position and the security position. All those positions are present in a war frame too. It is moral, it is religious often. There's an economic dividend, there's a peace dividend, there's a security frame. So maybe it could fit within that composite or a new deal if we went in that direction. Yeah, I think they're inherently all needed. I've just been very concerned, particularly with the security positioning, that terrorist states and hostile states and Arab Muslim states become the other, which just leads to a proclivity for more war with Iran, since they're in the top 3 in oil reserves, as an example. So I do have some concerns on some of those positions.
So some of them might be still available for others to use, even if you would counsel people ought to be using the war frame, perhaps. Is that,
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Where would you put, there's the talk of the New Deal, but the Roosevelt that seems most relevant for this discussion is his uncle, and Teddy Roosevelt. Is there anything in the history of the communication strategy to produce the national park system that could be helpful in this respect? And I don't know the particular way in which that was structured. I don't know if that's been something you know anything about, or is it relevant for?
It's interesting because the national parks did come up in some of the literature. Teddy, I think, I'm just going to pull a nugget, this may not be where you're going in terms of the NPS and how it was rolled out, but he himself was very much a man, and would, when he would go into the wilderness, escape from his security personnel and detail, Secret Service, they didn't really have it back then, and wander for days on end by himself because he loved nature so much. And I think what is exemplified in, I mean, this is a purely masculine analysis, but it's been interesting for me to portray myself as someone green as a vegetarian, because people tend to think, one, I found in the data, media and members of Congress didn't want to go green, eat tofu, because they spoke of it in pejorative language, like, you know, yeah, we're changing our light bulbs and we're turning down the heat, but I'm not going to like eat tofu instead of steak. I'm not going to go out and buy a Prius. There's an inherent weakness in going green, and I think I've only, as a tall 6'5" male, have had some interesting interactions. People are like, no, you're not. You know, there's disbelief. What works about Teddy and how he rolled it out is that he exemplified both, and why I think the war metaphor is so interesting. Since we're asking people to change their carbon consumption, the reason why it's not worked in the past is because America is a land of individual liberty. Don't constrain free markets. Don't constrain free behavior. A war metaphor or something other than that would allow for assertive behavior, so we're not being constrained against our individual liberties or free market behaviors, but that you can, it's a positive frame of moving forward rather than a limiting frame or a constraining frame, which is why so many people haven't gone green, because they don't want to be limited. And I think that same energy was exemplified by Teddy, which maybe allowed for a rollout.
Fascinating.
I don't know.
No, it's fascinating. I like thinking about this. I guess it's in fact his distant cousin, not his uncle. But the thing about it is that I hear in your answer is that we have to move into some uncomfortable terrain in your view, which is to employ war imagery when we might not want to dabble perhaps with masculinity where it might be uncomfortable to do so. I mean, one of the things that seems to be characteristic of that campaign was that. you mentioned immediately, if we go see his tribute, it's a sort of uncomfortable, anachronistic statue where where he celebrates certain things. I'm wondering if men are part of the problem in this more than women. I don't know the answer, but I could easily imagine it to be true. There are a lot of things that I was thinking about. I just want to get them out here. What about, in thinking, not to reveal your sources, but in looking back over your sample, have you noticed anything different in the attitude or behaviors or like policy positions or mode of responding in some of your sample now that we see the climate issue finally moving into the center of the conversation? Do you have any suspicions about how these folks you dealt with who struggled with or skeptical about being able to do anything or fatalistic about, is there any reason to hope that they may be changing now that Obama is coming out with a more muscular position on these things?
No on media, yes on members of Congress. I don't think media will change. They seem pretty entrenched in their skepticism. Yes, in terms of Congress feeling liberated by the executive branch taking the lead. They almost needed the executive branch, and there were comments by members of Congress, we just need the executive branch to lead. So if Obama does lead, I think it will free up members of Congress to lead. Certainly the war on terror, Bush led pretty strongly, so it made it easy for members of Congress to follow and go above and beyond their committee jurisdiction or any public mandate if there was one or not. But for Obama to really lead. And to your previous point about men getting in the way, and is science really the answer, I think Al Gore is a good example of an excessive reliance on science and being the wrong messenger for a whole bunch of reasons. But he keeps thinking that the science will carry the day.
Yeah.
But to your last point, I think we'll see improvement in engagement from members of Congress, but not media.
Will journalists follow if Congress goes far enough?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So
Journalists will follow because it'll be a political issue, and then they'll be able to cover it.
That's great. That's great. I have one last thing. So if we're in a war, who are our allies? And the main ally that it seems to me, and this brings up the question of international fatalism, which seems to be one of the ways that, even if I examine my own attitudes, I think I find it to say, well, how do you deal with this problem because of the international context? You can almost take the United States out of the equation. Not yet, but if you were to take the extra 2 billion coming online who want automobiles and so on, still it would be a difficult problem. Is there some way to join forces with China, for example? Because that seems to be the other that people point to. That is, we can't do anything because of China and India. There's all this language.
Right.
And I don't know if that came up in the data or not, but I assume that at least there is some fear of the Chinese growth and the Indian growth.
Yeah.
Are there any ways that you could imagine linking up those emerging great powers with the United States agenda and have that kind of a push, or is that a bad strategy?
Well, you would certainly think private industry would be interested in that, because if you shift those three markets, those are serious populations, over 1 billion in China, over 1 billion in India. It did come up in the data, Republicans, interestingly, citing China as the leader, because in China, they're talking about peak oil already. It became convenient for American audiences to position China as the leader on the carbon emissions front, because a couple years ago, China surpassed America as a total emitter. They're a bigger national emitter than we are. That was very convenient for Americans. They were like, okay, we don't have to be the top emitter. But still, if it's broken down, I notice in newspapers they don't always make the distinction. We're still the biggest emitter per person per year. But yeah, I think it would be private sector leading the way, just given with Obama's defensive Asia pivot on a military front, we're still kind of keeping Cold War systems ready for an eventual U.S.-China war if we have one. So it would have to be, I would think, private sector leading the way, just based on consumption habits, if they can switch the dial. Last, I wanted to note something I struggled with in terms of climate conflict, and seeing 3 different spheres of potential analysis, and I didn't know necessarily where to drill down, whether it was the internal conflict between belief and behavior and why there was a discord or dissonance, the conflict in the civil sphere in the positioning that I mentioned, or the actual environmental conflict that's going to come from resource scarcity and a warming climate, and 3 different layers. And I think I was trying to cover at least the first 2, not the third. That wasn't really my focus. But I noted that there's more work to be done there.
That's great, Michael. Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other from the committee before we move to the audience? Questions from the audience? I'm going to handle it.
Diane.
Anyway, thank you, that was wonderful. And I had no idea you were working on this, but I've been a vegetarian for 43 years. I'm trying to raise and have 3 kids. And I was arrested for the Keystone Pipeline, and I know chairperson had been conference on climate change with mediators, climate conflict. So, and also Psychologists for Social Responsibility has a task force on this, and the American Psychological Association has a task force in the paper. So some of the main points is that there's a weak, well, like you say, there's a weak correlation between attitude and behavior change. One is because it seems so gradual, but I think that was years ago. I think now with Sandy and everything, that's changing. But people don't change their behavior because of guilt, fear, doom and gloom, and focus on individual responsibility. They change their behavior if there's, like, if everyone's doing something together and if they have procedural knowledge, like I can change a light bulb, or I think here with the 5-cent tax on bags, that changed, there was some law, and then also that buying reusable bags was much cheaper. So if there's something that everybody's doing, and also people want to feel good and about what they're doing, and then it's cool. Regarding terrorism, people are much more, in my early work was on the image of the enemy, people are much more easily gripped by an image of an outside enemy, and part of the psychological issue with climate is that it's our fault, and that especially the deniers don't want to look like, human conflict, like it's not our fault. Like we don't want to think that we're contributing, well, they don't want to think that there's human contributing to it. I don't think war is a good metaphor, and also the war on cancer and poverty, they're not doing too well. And also they're like going after the symptom instead of the cause, and I've also been involved with cancer for many decades. And that there's much more to do with prevention and nutrition and detoxification and a lot of the progressive toxic, there's a lot of money in the cancer industry also that's similar. And I think that people change their behavior if they have products that are fun and cool and make it easy for them to do so. And I also have a patent pending, hopefully in the next few months I'll have a patent on products to eliminate paper, plastic, and styrofoam and a lot of energy and waste that are reusable. So I'll let you know when I get that. And like if Richard Branson he's put money into getting a fuel. So I think like if there is a fuel that's environmental, that people will like it, and there's people want to feel good. So I think that has to be part of it. And one metaphor I have, which I don't know if it quite works, is like Apollo 13, when that happened, like the whole world was gathered on trying to figure out how to save them, the scientists and
Sure, yeah.
So something heroic like that. And then, so anyway, my question, what worries me now is that it seems like there's a big change in the discourse on fracking. Like before it was toxic, and now people are saying, we should do it if there's regulation, or that there's so much infrastructure and there's so much money in it, and it'll save us from the security issue from foreign oil, and we can just frack this. And there's a lot of denial of the dangers of it. So anyway, that worries me right now. And on February 17th, there's another demonstration for the Keystone Pipeline here in Washington.
Yeah. I think short of a war, there's plenty we can do. And thinking of Sergeant Shriver and all that he did with the Kennedys in the various offices that he created, and the war on poverty, but even short of a war on poverty, the offices that he created to focus on low-income communities could be explored in a campaign, in a federal campaign, in partnership with the grassroots campaign, not unlike the tobacco campaign, short of a war. Secondly, I'm very interested in what the Pentagon is doing, because the Pentagon is very, in bed is too subjective, but they are coordinating pretty actively with Hollywood to produce certain movies. And it's out in the open, it's known, it's understood, sometimes commissioned, often in partnership. And I just think, given how closely coordinated the administration is with Hollywood on that front, could we do similar partnerships on this front? And I think there's just a lot of potential to partner federal, Hollywood, that just hasn't been explored, that easily could be explored. Thank you, Jen. Julie? And then
So I think in thinking about the media members, and one of the things that become aware of through the research I'm doing is how often they are unself-aware of this, how they're structuring articles, what they're writing about, and what those impacts are. So they see themselves as trade professionals, that have certain standards, but are not being really at all reflective about what the impact of those standards are, then on the media they're producing.
Yeah, because this is your dissertation too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was really interested in the point you were making about on climate change, how they're maintaining the stance and they have to be neutral or have some kind of non-subjectivity. Whereas on terrorism, they're willing to be completely one-sided. I mean, and is that because there is an other? I mean, there really is a morally repugnant other, as opposed to on the climate change debate, for them to take one side or the other. They would be identifying the deniers, for instance, as unknowledgeable, as regressive, whatever words you want to use. But they would have to be labeling them in some way. Whereas for terrorism, they're perfectly comfortable labeling a group that engages in terrorist attacks. So I just playing with that idea a little bit, and I'm not sure it's necessarily a question, but just to think what is those differences between why they feel like this neutrality applies to climate change, but they're perfectly willing to abandon it in the terrorism case. I think it's an interesting.
Yeah, and I think you've got part of it. I would add that increasingly they're really captivated by power, and this is why they don't tend to question intelligence, military intelligence, quite like I think they should. And why I answered to your question that they would follow if Congress led. So if Obama leads, Congress leads in pursuit, and then media will fall behind. Because they claim it's journalistic integrity, but I think there's just the lack of leadership, and if there would be leadership, they would follow, because cognitively they're on board. Even reporters that I thought would go above and beyond this journalistic integrity and actually report the science don't, and it confounds me. So I yes, and I think.
So if the military came out with strong statements on the environmental impact on national security, I mean, on the impact of climate change on national security, and actually it's something my father's been working on.
Right, and they're getting there, yeah.
Working on energy, collecting solar energy through satellites for military uses, so that they're not having to manage petroleum products. So if they came out with something, if there was some way to mobilize that community to endorse the science, that might get journalists.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it would be interesting to study who media revere, because that would change the media writing, without question. And the Pentagon is headed in that direction. Quietly, yeah, but leading those energy conversations. Yeah, sorry, I don't know.
I just want to comment on that. So you studied this dissonance between attitude and behavior, and I think that wall frame actually could help you explain that. Because actually the enemy is also the self, and I think the we call it Republican or oil company, like they make that linkage tight by saying like, oh, if you want go solar power, then it's going to be expensive. So eventually the self becomes the enemy, like a regular fox. And they make that tight, while like the war on terrorism, like it's totally external. Like those people are not me. So I think like if you want to use that frame, the job to do is to dislink, to disconnect that linkage.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think there is a potential for the self to change their consumptive behavior, but it requires something, some kind of superordinate goal. And to Diane's point, I think people want to be good. They want to act good. They want to do good behavior. They want that. Sustainable products will get us, in my mind, only so far. So how do we switch industries, subsidize green industries, but there's something more there, and I'm not sure what that is, and maybe it's the communicative action with the actual products we're consuming from cradle to grave, but there's something more that we'll really need to elevate the self up to that superordinate goal. Yeah.
You mentioned Hollywood teaming, or government teaming with Hollywood, and I guess it makes me really nervous when the government is teaming with the arts to get a message out. And you know, the whole idea of propaganda and the term social engineering just terrifies me. So I guess what I'm wondering, and I also looking at the frames that you presented, the stewardship and the green equals profits and American security, those all appeal to me. Maybe coming from a little bit more conservative background. So I guess my question for you is, why, it seems to me you're proposing a singular message, a singular approach to the war, and getting away from these multiple narratives. Did I hear that right? And why not multiple?
A multiplicity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, to Dr. Simmons' question, because of similar nature, are those other positions still useful? And I think they are. What's happened with the American energy security or an energy independence narrative and positioning, not only has it created another, but it hasn't actually led to greener behavior. So Keystone being an example of a desire to drill more here. We have resources, and we do. We're so blessed with resources. So America should be energy secure and energy independent. I believe that. Why not? We might engage in fewer wars in the Middle East as a result. We might not demonize Venezuela or Cuba as much. But it's not leading to greener behavior here. It's just justifying more drilling here in the pursuit of fossil fuels, not renewable energy. If it was in the pursuit of the incredible, bountiful wind energy and solar energy we have, which is totally renewable and totally sustainable, in my perspective, then I would support that. So maybe it is working within the energy security frame, but creating a campaign to make sure that energy security frame doesn't necessarily other the Arab and the Muslim, and also leads to more sustainable behavior with wind and solar. But certainly it's not exclusive. I was exploring and extrapolating with the war metaphor to see if it had resonance, but to Dr. Rubenstein's point, definitely pivoted back to the structural engineering, which I think is more important. It's macro-theoretical, and I think that's the work that really needs to be done within the economic and political spheres. Working in the political sector, just being devastated by the fact that there is an absolute disconnect between the public, their faith in Congress, which is at an all-time low, and their ability to get anything done. So I think that's what we need to focus on. The war frame was an exercise in seeing if there was a cultural language there that would be useful, and maybe it's not. Thanks for. Yeah, Mara.
So, I have lots of questions, and you know, having the war metaphor, I think, is it's a trigger because it places it in a conversation with we're about peace building and conflict resolution and conflict transformation. So I think it raises interesting questions. And one of the frameworks that circulates to the field is the idea of we have management, conflict resolution is in reaction to management approaches, conflict transformation, even post conflict resolution. And you've added a conquer metaphor to that. So I wonder if you think of that as sort of as common framework for talking about responses to issues, problems, concerns, crises, management, resolution, transformation, conquer. Where does the conquer fit with that in that frame? And I've got another question.
Yeah, it doesn't. My concern about if we were to apply conflict language to this and to the environmental work, my concern about management is an adaptive geoengineering approach. Like, we can manage our way out of this crisis, and I don't think we can. I explored conquer in part because, per my response to Dr. Simmons, some of the frames that go against the green movement are free market frames, individual liberties, and don't constrain or restrain our individual liberties. But citizens in the past, whether it was in the New Deal or in War and Poverty or War and Other, have been able to rise above to pursue some kind of egalitarian collectivist thinking in that moment and drop their attachment to free individual liberties in the pursuit of something higher. And that's why I was pursuing it. Yeah, I mean, it would be everyone who has known me and known my sensitivity to language would be surprised, frankly, that I would even suggest this. So I don't know that it fits within at all the trajectory of resolution, management, transformation. I think transformative, why I use transforming political structures and transforming economic structures, that if we actually did that alone, particularly on the economic, if I was killing the calf, if I was picking the cotton and it was bleeding on my hands, if I was chopping down the tree for my house and getting the ore out for a car that somehow I was making, that's less relevant here in the analogy, but everything other, like if I was killing the animal, I would probably behave very, very differently, right? Much more sustainably. If you look at indigenous communities, First Nations communities, Native Americans, their sustainability increased when they had communicative action, when they had a life world with natural capital. We don't have that anymore. So how do you, so that would be transformative, and maybe that's the focus. That's the transformation that needs to happen.
Well, and that seems like to link the communicative action to actions relevant to climate change seems a very different sector of action and agency that you're talking about. That there are elements of individualism, there are elements of creating a demand for policy change. So I see, sort of a few different conceptual conversations going on there on what creates action, and that's the war metaphor to being connected to the effects of climate change is a very different. To me, that seems a different realm of conversation than the war metaphor. The war, because then that's not in some ways, to me, that puts us in the management realm. What can I do to respond? Not what can I do to minimize or reduce, but management isn't only contained kinds of ideas. I think that's a whole other bucket. So I wonder if there's not a piece of the conversation with the idea of conquer or eliminate. Can we stop climate change? Can we prevent it from happening? Can we subdue it? Creates an interesting demand on sort of the visualization of what we have to, because that's a war metaphor that is a subdue, eliminate, reduce, destroy metaphor, as opposed to the actions created to World War II were victory gardens, which is a positive action, not a negative action. So I see some disconnect conceptually between at what level of action are we talking about policy and decision making, are we talking about the social cultural realm of influence and policy making, are we talking about what individuals are doing vis-a-vis consumption in their homes. And I think you've linked them nicely, that there's a rough patch there. And to me, there's a piece of it that's around thinking of responses to crisis. And originally, I didn't have a speech, I had a question. I always get, you get tempted by these things. And it started with also a question of, conceptually, when you set up the problem around what constitutes claims making, I saw two assumptions. One, framing the crisis, something as something to be conquered, that we're creating a crisis, and we're creating fear. That those were both pieces of the moral panic, the hot crisis, and a lack of social capital were three assumptions that were made, and sort of what's the theory of what would motivate change. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the need for fear and the sense that there's a low social capital.
Right. So a couple things. To your first point, the environmental sociologists that have been writing on this usually end their pieces with a bit of a question mark. Their conclusions are, I felt, question mark, like the verdict is out. And in part because this is a conflict like no other. I mean, it is ubiquitous in our economy. Our economy has depended on fossil fuel because we've subsidized that. But climate change is something we've never experienced before. And so I see environmental sociologists struggling with that rough patch, that conundrum. And why I want our community to engage even more so we can smooth out that rough patch if it's possible. To the assumptions, I don't want more fear, and where the sociologists had consensus is that actually if there's too much fear or dread or latent dread, that it's debilitating. And that came up in the data too, that the median members of Congress talked about complacency and fatalism. And I certainly see it around me, certainly with my family, that too much fear actually has a deleterious effect, and there's disengagement, not engagement. I didn't know if in previous wars, and this would require some study, war on poverty, war on cancer, war on drugs, if it was possible to rally the publics in such a way, and policymakers and media, in a way that doesn't necessarily install or instill more fear, because I'm not a fan of fear-based messaging either, and maybe there's not. Yeah, I do have problems with the terms hot crises, moral panics. I don't want panic. That's not useful. People aren't thinking clearly in a panic mode. But can you... Yeah, right. And even social scare, necessarily. I felt like the data was saying, a lot of the theorists were saying the same thing, and I wanted more, and there wasn't necessarily more outside. Could you create a flight corridor? Okay, flight corridor, that makes sense. Like, but does it limit it to a communications campaign? No, it's more than that. Like, how do we rally the public in something more? I do think increasingly we have low social capital, and I don't think that's entirely an assumption. Certainly there are patches of higher social capital and egalitarian worldviews as studied by GMU Yale, but I think increasingly because of inequality is growing, the social capital that maybe we once had has been eroded by what Dr. Rubenstein said, tax, trade, labor policy that has created a real gap in this country. Now, I would need to do even more extensive studies to really see how that plays out. And Adger does in talking about social capital. But his study, Neil Adger's study, was in Africa. I wondered, I would be interested in interviewing him. Could you not find a study here where high social capital led to an effective response to environmental conflict? That his case studies were outside the US. And I think, again, in smaller economies and smaller democracies, you have the likelihood of maybe higher social capital if there's more egalitarianism. But I think income inequality has quickly and vastly eroded social capital in the US.
I think that one of the areas is that I think the management and the questioning that is there or is there not a lack of social capital comes is that the responses, I think in coastal communities in particular that are seeing more immediately the effects of climate change and are utilizing opportunities for policy responses, and something has to be done. So I think there are differences in where and how people are responding to the effects of global warming, of climate change. And I think one of the areas that's interesting to look at is in coastal areas where it's in front and people sort of leapfrog over, well, we don't know whether or not it's happening, whether or not it's real, but it's happening.
Yep.
So what are we going to do? And then to me, that bridges a management fear world, and there's a zone of creativity there that maybe.
Yeah. We won't even need the campaign I described at the pace we're headed with natural disasters. To your geography point, that was a point in my data too, that members of Congress on the coast were fully on board. Members of Congress in the Midwest where they're not seeing it, though we had some unprecedented droughts, so they would say it's cyclical. But coastal communities, from a congressional standpoint, the data showed that they were very much on board the climate train. So yeah. Thank you. Someone else?
Questions? Okay. I think that why don't we retire to a neighboring room and have a discussion?
Sounds good.
Okay, great.
Thank you.